Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer and myself here to talk about ways to make threat actors cry, which I thought was a pretty cool title for this. And so we're going to get into it. But, if you like this stuff that we're doing, please like, share, follow, subscribe, whatever the things are that you need to do the things.
Whatever the cool kids are doing these days.
Right. So what are we talking about, Spencer? That's kind of an ambiguous title. So like we gotta
yeah. So the context for this the title of this episode is I wanted to talk about things that mature organizations are doing, that mature and proactive organizations are doing to better protect their organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
We both talk about blocking and tackling a lot. Defense in depth, layered security, right? You got to do the basics, and you do the basics well, and that will help, and it'll go a long way. These are things that are a little bit more not advanced, but these are things that more mature organizations are getting their hands on and implementing. They're being more proactive in implementing controls that are maybe a little bit harder to implement, or they take a little bit more understanding or technical understanding to implement. So that's kind of the reason for this. And the partial inspiration for this, right, are those penetration test engagements where you can't do anything. Like there are really well secured organizations out there, and sometimes you come up against those, and part of you as a pen tester is like, oh, I want to get past this thing. I want to do this cool evasion technique, or like get by this control or this EDR product or whatever it is. And, sometimes you just spin your wheels and you can't gain any ground. You can't do anything because it's a very well secured environment. And that happens. And this is partially the inspiration for that. Right. And an alternative title to this was going to be how to make pen testers cry. But for the sake of putting this in the context of what really matters, right, is stopping bad guys, stopping criminals, stopping real attackers. That's the real focus of this. So we're on the same team, and ultimately we have the same goals, which is defense in depth, layered defense, et cetera. Make the attackers work harder, make them perform more actions, make them have to make more noise. So ultimately it helps us detect them and eject them from the environment.
Love it. I love it. And there was a reason that you chose to talk about endpoint security on Windows in a Microsoft environment as the bulk of this particular discussion, right? And that's because the attack surface, for those of you who have been in security for a while, will follow along when I say the attack surface is changed, right? It's not your firewall and your public-facing stuff anymore. Yes, that still exists. But we've been doing a pretty good job of securing public-facing stuff for the last 20 years. We've done a horrific job of securing the actual front lines of the initial access battle, and that is the endpoint. And so that is where we're focusing today, right?
Yep. And ultimately, our businesses rely on people doing work on a computer, right?
Yeah.
And they work on a computer and an endpoint, and that endpoint has applications installed, it has different things. People are allowed to go to the internet and click on things and download things and execute things. So people need to do things to do their job. And all of these things that we're going to talk about, like you said, are specific to endpoints, specific controls to kind of harden those endpoints and make it harder for attackers to execute code and obtain credentials and things like that.
Sure.
And these are predominantly, mostly all, I guess, Windows-based controls, so Windows-based environments. And one of them is specific to Defender Antivirus if you're running that. So if you don't have a Defender Antivirus enabled, some of these controls are not going to be applicable to you, but they're good examples because other EDR products implement the same things.
Right.
They just call them different things. So something to look for.
So if you're riding with Carbon Black or CrowdStrike or something like that, then look at their equivalent of the thing that we're going to talk about. So
yep.
Cool. All right, good context, man. So,
Yeah.
so what is your first recommendation? And these aren't in order of importance, right? It's just like all of these are equally critical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So they're all really important. I kind of ordered them in the order that I will typically come across them sometimes on a
Sure.
penetration test. So one of the first things I'll do is I'll look at PowerShell, right? I'll look at how the organization has both restricted PowerShell and how they're logging it, or if they're logging it at all, right?
Right.
And that's the first thing that can be a barrier for threat actors. Now, since they're moving to different languages like Rust and Nim and stuff like that, this is becoming less important because threat actors are realizing that and they're moving away from PowerShell.
Sure.
But we still see PowerShell every day. I mean, we still see encoded PowerShell, getting download, or, using encoded PowerShell to download the malware, and that still happens
Sure.
quite a bit. So PowerShell logging and restrictions. And one of the best ways to restrict PowerShell is AMSI. AMSI, and I guess it's not a restriction, but kind of a detection, right? AMSI is the anti-malware scanning interface. And that helps you detect bad stuff that's happening in things like PowerShell, VBScript, VBA macros, .NET even, and various other different things. And what this does is Microsoft created this to help combat against fileless malware.
Right.
PowerShell being kind of the biggest offender of that. And it's very much signature based. It looks for certain things in scripts and in these components that I just mentioned, and it will try and help detect that bad stuff from happening. And ultimately, for example, with PowerShell, even if your script is obfuscated, right? If I use some sort of obfuscation technique, ultimately it has to be deobfuscated before it gets executed as a script block.
Right.
So the way that AMSI works is that once everything's done and it's all deobfuscated and everything, it looks at the strings and it looks at the context of that script or that component or whatever it's executing, and it'll look for things that are known bad things.
Right.
Now this can be bypassed. There are a number of AMSI bypasses. It's a very common thing to do. However, something that we see is some antivirus vendors, some EDR vendors are either not incorporating AMSI or they're not doing enough with AMSI to detect those things, and bypassing those are fairly trivial. So PowerShell restrictions, and particularly AMSI, is something we look for on a pen test, and that's something that attackers will abuse, and they will use PowerShell if it's available.
Yeah. And just talking about PowerShell broadly from a security perspective, we used to get the question a lot of, just turn it off. Like we don't want, how can I disable PowerShell? How can I, restrict it in my environment? And the real answer to that, you don't. Right. You can't turn PowerShell off. It's integrated into the operating system. In many cases, especially in large organizations, it is a dependency for certain types of administration, right? And updates and things of that nature. So, don't look at PowerShell as this evil thing, because it's not that. It's just a mechanism, right? And I would even make the opposite argument that PowerShell is an opportunity to catch people doing shady stuff, right? Or catch bad actors doing shady stuff, because like you said, it is a common vector by which, folks will interact with the operating system. And so, just keep that in mind, right? Like we're advising folks, embrace PowerShell. It's not going anywhere. Right. And I would still argue, even though a lot of the more advanced threat actors are going away from PowerShell, the kind of large body of mediocre threat actors are probably still going to be using PowerShell in some capacity. So it is still important. It's still relevant. And rather than shun it, let's embrace it and leverage it as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, using it as a defense mechanism or using it to our advantage, an example of that would be, if Susie in accounting is executing PowerShell and there's sub-processes created from PowerShell, that's probably going to be fairly suspicious, right? As opposed to somebody in IT executing things in PowerShell, right? So there's ways to detect the PowerShell abuse. And then the other thing I'll say with PowerShell is constrained language mode and execution policy. If you restrict administrative access on your endpoints, and if you set constrained language mode and execution policy, those two things together can also be a deterrent from executing PowerShell. Now, there's a number of bypasses, just like everything else, but those things create additional steps. They create additional noise, additional opportunities for detection.
Yep.
So those are also good things to look into. And kind of when you look at restricting PowerShell as a whole, there's a number of things that you want to do to properly secure PowerShell in your environment.
Yeah, agreed. It's good stuff.
So the next thing that really frustrates attackers and pen testers alike is application control. Sometimes called application allow listing, in a number of different variants of this, of the terminology, but essentially it's restricting what executables, what programs can run on a computer at any given computer.
Right.
And the reason this is important is because threat actors are moving away from PowerShell to executables and binaries, right? This has become more important. Restricting what executables can run and from where, and only allowing those reputable. There we go.
Yeah.
Got it. That was a tough one to say.
Right.
Only allowing reputable software to run that you've already allowed is another mature kind of security strategy.
Yeah, agreed. And this one is a big lift, right? Because in order to implement something like this, you will generally have to have already mastered certain aspects of your IT policies and procedures, right?
Yep.
And what I mean by that is you have to have a proper software inventory. You probably need to have a gold image, right? That's pretty locked down. You need to not have users as local admins. You need to have a standardized asset management I could go on, right? But
Yep.
I don't want to bore everybody, but you need to be in a good place and be aware of what's on your endpoints before you can implement. I think we called it application whitelisting or something, was like a broad term used some time ago. But it is, in my opinion, pretty close to the mecca of endpoint security, right? If you can reach this point, you're doing hot stuff, man.
Yeah, really good stuff. And like you said, not an easy lift.
Right.
There's ways with App Locker is built into Windows, and you can turn it on in audit mode, and you can see what applications are running and what would have been blocked by the default rules or whatnot.
Sure.
There's third-party software, like AirLock is one that I've seen. I've not used myself, but I've seen kind of demos of it that look really interesting. So there's both kind of built-in Windows programs that you can use that are free, App Locker or software restriction policies, but App Locker is the new control there, or the new product. And it's there's also Windows Defender Application Control, which I think is maybe the new terminology for it. But App Locker, right? App Locker, there's third-party products. And what's great is you can restrict those applications based on their hash, based on the publisher, the path.
Right.
You can specify who can execute that program and things like that. So really good way to control what applications are allowed to execute in your environment.
Good stuff, man.
Cool. So the next one is something I referenced earlier when I said that one of these things was specific to Defender Antivirus, and this was that thing, and that is attack surface reduction rules. So ASR rules, as they're commonly referred to as. And the name kind of says it all with this. It's kind of self-explanatory. They help reduce attack surface, but that's generic, right? That's kind of like, okay, tell me what that means. So what these rules are, these are things that you can enable via Defender Antivirus that restrict certain things from happening, certain risky behaviors from happening. So for example, one of the ASR rules is blocking all Office applications from executing child processes, right? From creating child processes. Same with Adobe. Another example would be blocking credential stealing attempts from Windows Local Security Authority. So
Cool.
these attack surface reduction rules help prevent some commonly abused risky behaviors. And what that does is it just gives you another opportunity to make the bad guys, the bad actors, have to try harder and find ways to bypass those things or to take additional steps to achieve their outcome. And hopefully those ultimately block the attack altogether. And those, like I said, those are available if you're using Windows Defender Antivirus, and if it's in active mode. The other consideration is with so if you're using Defender Antivirus, you can get those rules, you can enable them. If you use Defender for Endpoint with the E5 license, you get additional kind of bells and whistles that you can use to deploy and manage those rules, and get analytics and reporting data from those rules and things like that. So Microsoft does gate some of those things behind a paywall, which is unfortunate.
Right.
But you can still use those rules if you use Defender Antivirus, which is great.
And it sounds like, though, the bulk of the lifting done by ASR is included for free. But if you want to kind of do the enterprise management thing, those are the features that are like you said, gated. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and this is so you can run these rules on Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise 1709 and later, and Server 2012 R2 and later or newer, and Windows 11 Pro and Enterprise. So a vast majority of your fleet of servers or workstations should be able to run these rules if you're using Defender Antivirus, right?
Right.
So that's a key component. Now, something you mentioned earlier was, if you're not using Defender for Antivirus, right? Maybe you're using Carbon Black and Defender Antivirus is disabled. It's not in active mode. Those EDR vendors have similar things. They call them different things, but those products are looking for these behaviors as well.
Sure.
So this is not something that's limited to Microsoft, but something that's built in for free that you can use to get started with.
Good. Yeah. And I think the larger takeaway here is antivirus is not enough. Right? Like, yes, you need to do that. That is blocking and tackling, is having some type of anti-malware, antivirus on your endpoints. But it's just not enough if you want to be serious. And that's where EDR and ASR and those type of things come into play, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, really good stuff. Now getting more, I guess, not necessarily more advanced, but more proactive, and more of a mature control, kind of going down the chain, is Credential Guard. So one of the common things that attackers like to do is they like to steal credentials. Credentials help them pivot, deploy ransomware. Credentials are very much so the keys of the kingdom, right?
That's why we keep them on shared drives that everybody can access, right?
Exactly. Just in a Word document, you never know when you need that domain admin password.
Right. So, yeah.
Yep. But yeah, credentials are the keys of the kingdom, and threat actors know that, and that's why stealing credentials from memory in this case is a very sought after technique. Threat actors can use things like Mimikatz. They can dump credentials from memory with various different tools. One of which is Mimikatz. You can do all sorts of different crazy fun stuff, right? Credential Guard is, again, Microsoft's attempt to secure their operating system, right? They're trying to be proactive and secure their operating system, and Credential Guard is one of those attempts to do that. Credential Guard is nice because it protects those credentials in memory, and it uses virtualization-based security and all these fancy things, but essentially at the core of it, it protects those credentials and only allows certain processes that are allowed to access those credentials. It only allows them access to it. Sure. So it helps prevent those credential stealing attacks, those Mimikatz type password dumping attacks. And then it helps protect those credentials in memory so that if somebody does get on the system, they have a harder time extracting those credentials.
Sure. Is this enabled by default?
No, so this is something that is not a default. This is not enabled by default. However, I've heard that in Windows 11, some of these hardening things that you can do in Windows 10 are on by default. So
Cool.
Microsoft is kind of taking note and seeing that this is a trend, and they need to start doing more default secure. They need to be taking more steps to secure things by default. I mean,
Makes sense.
and
Yeah.
this is one of those things that's coming. But Credential Guard helps protect NTLM credentials, helps protect against Kerberos ticket attacks, and other types of in-memory credential attacks.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's really good. Windows 10 and newer, Server 2016 and newer is where this is feasible. So if you have those operating systems, Credentials Guard can be a good way to prevent getting access to those credentials.
Nice.
The next thing that is not something. So Credential Guard and this next one, which are protected users, the protected users group or protected user security group. These are two things that I find are not commonly talked about or known throughout our engagements with companies, and particularly smaller IT firms or smaller IT teams who are not as familiar with implementing these things. Right, they're a smaller team. They don't have the high level sophistication that a large team does. These are things that are commonly missed, right? These are things
Sure.
that we don't see as often, but like we said, these are things that mature organizations are doing to be proactive. So the protected users group. So this is a group in Active Directory that you can put admin accounts in, and it helps protect those accounts from credential-based attacks again. So what this does is you put these admin accounts in the security group, and then on endpoints that are applicable, which is Server 2012 and above, and Windows 8.1 and above, those NTLM credentials and WDigest credentials are not available they're not cached as plain text in the memory. So even if those settings are turned on the endpoint, those credentials are not stored as plain text.
So cool. Yeah.
It also prevents the DES and RC4 keys from being used. So that's really awesome. So this is a kind of a hidden gem with protecting admin accounts.
Nice.
And it prevents NTLM authentication from being used. So only Kerberos is available for these accounts.
Right. So there might be some compatibility issues there if you have older systems that are still leveraging NTLM or require RC4. So, but generally speaking, I don't see that a ton.
Yeah.
So you can
Yep.
check it out. But
yeah, so this group, it's not advisable to put service accounts in this group because of that reason. So this is really for admin accounts that are your admin account that's you're using to log into systems, right? And do
Right.
administrative tasks.
yeah. And all right. So far, everything we've touched on is free.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, now don't get me wrong. EDR is not free, like DFE and CrowdStrike.
Sure.
But if you already have those things,
Yep.
enabling the equivalent of ASR or the attack surface reduction rules is free.
Yep.
And so I like pointing that out because, and I don't know if you've had the same observation I have, but the vast majority of the time that we have significant critical findings and penetration tests, the fix is not, it's not a spend.
Yeah.
Right. It's just work.
Yeah. So aside from like the application allow listing or waitlisting products that you can get that are commercial offerings, yeah, these things all the things we mentioned are things that are built into Windows. As long as you're on a modern version of Windows, you can use these things.
So it's not going to work on my Windows 98 box.
No.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. All right, good. So I just wanted to point that out because the next one is a spend. It's a product, right?
It can be, yeah. So the next one is Honey Tokens, Honey Pots. There's a great company called Canary. Sorry,
It's Thinks
Canary.
Canary. Yeah,
Thinks
they're
Canary.
absolute rock stars. By the way, we're not partnered with them. We just love what they do.
Yep.
So
I was about to say Red Canary because I was just reading a Red Canary article before we recorded this.
no, that's a
And I'm
different
like,
thing.
that's not it. Also a great company, but thinks Canary.
Yeah.
That's the company that's most well known, I think, for Canary tokens right now. They've kind of been the trendsetters for Canary tokens and Honey tokens for a while now. And what this is an early warning system. So an example or a use case would be if I want to, catch somebody doing something bad, like opening up a document that they probably shouldn't, like a document with passwords in it, I can put a Canary token in a Word document. And then when that Word document gets opened, I get an alert. And there's some specific thing that you put in there, you get an alert for it. So you know when that was opened, what the IP address was, and all this different information. So it can use it as an early warning system. Mm-hmm. So if a bad guy's on your network and they're looking through documents for passwords and they open one of these things and they trip it, well, you've just got an alert that's a very low false positive of something bad that could be going on. So like you said, there is a commercial offering. They have a commercial offering for this. There are other companies that offer honeypots and honey token type software to do this. But Canary token or Thinkus Canary does offer a large amount of free Canary tokens that you can use to get started with.
Yeah. So everywhere I have ever worked in a professional capacity as a security engineer, analyst, whatever you want to call it, we always deployed honey tokens, honeypots. We always bought the canaries. They're little bitty appliances that you plug in and use. They're small and they run on USB power, so you can put them in the server room, pretty much anywhere. And they are absolute cash money when it comes to. And we've caught like employees snooping around on the network. Threat actors, mostly pen testers. And so it was really, it's really cool. And what I like the most about them is your false positive rate is very low.
Yeah.
Right. Like someone actually has to do an action, in most cases, a manual action, in order for this thing to fire. And I don't know, man, I just can't say enough good things about it. Really.
Yeah. Yeah. And this can be a good way to detect Kerberos in your environment, right?
Right. Yeah.
You could potentially detect when a Kerberos service ticket is requested for a Canary token that you've set up or a Honey token that you've set up, a Honey account. Mm-hmm. You can, use that as an early warning system for Kerberos. You can, some other use cases that I think are kind of cool are when an AWS key is used. So you can, use a Canary token in an AWS key. When a website is cloned. So that's kind of neat, right? If you want to know when a website's closed, like your website, like if you have a kind of a unique login page or something.
Yep.
And you want to know, hey, if somebody's cloning this for a phishing attack, might be something you'd want to know.
Sure.
When a SQL server is accessed, and there's a ton other use cases for this. And this gets into kind of the active defense type thing that people talk about sometimes, but can be really good as an early warning system to help catch bad guys before they're able to do really, really bad stuff.
Agreed. Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend. And the cost is low. Even if you go with a paid service, man, it's like a couple grand a year or some silly number that is totally reasonable for what you get.
If your time, it's just your time, right? Like it's your time in learning and researching. And if you're not familiar with these things, spend a couple hours, 10, 20 hours, learning about these things, how the technology works, how to implement them. There's tons of free resources on YouTube, on the internet about how to implement these things, the best ways to do those things. We're a resource, obviously we can help talk through a lot of these things. And we do when we do penetration tests and we come against secured environments or less secured environments, we say, hey, these are things that you can do that would improve in this area, right? We were able to do this thing. Here's some way that you can better help, help protect or detect these things.
Yep.
So these are things we talk about often, and we're happy to give help and recommendations and advice on these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Yeah, man. These are great topics. You know, like Spencer said, we encourage you to go check them out for yourself. Low cost or no cost things that will make you a heck of a lot more secure. And yeah, man, if you have questions, reach out and get a hold of us. So
Yeah.
that's all we have for you today. If you enjoyed this, folks, please share it. That's the best thing you can do to help us out, is to spread the word, and check out our blog over at offsec.blog. We will see you next time.